Hello. On behalf of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Defenders of Wildlife, welcome to our third webinar in our Wildlife and Wind Energy series titled Grouse, Considerations for Developing Wind Energy in Grouse Habitat. My name is Shana Steingard, and I'm a Renewable Energy and Wildlife Policy Analyst with Defenders of Wildlife, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll start with a quick review of some housekeeping items, an overview of the series, and an introduction to our four speakers. While you'll be muted during the webinar, please feel free to communicate with our meeting organizers and panelists through the questions feature on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll respond to substantive questions during Q&A or after the webinar. But we can also help clarify acronyms and webinar logistics in real time. For any persistent technical issues, please go to www.support.goto.com. And we'll also call upon you during the webinar to answer several trivia questions, so please stay tuned. If you're interested in continued learning on grouse and wind or other related topics, you can find a wealth of resources through the knowledge base at tethys.pnnl.gov. And as we continue finalizing our dates for this 9-part series, please sign up for updates so that you can join us for all upcoming installments, including our webinar next week titled Bats, Methodologies and Technologies Used to Study Impacts of Wind Turbines on Bats on September 24th. Right. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to our four speakers. Mark Salvo, a former Defender of Wildlife and now the Program Director at Oregon Natural Desert Association. John Lloyd, Associate Director of Research at American Wind Wildlife Institute. Chad LeBeau, Research Biologist at West Inc. And finally, Christy Calabrese, Director of Permitting and Environmental Affairs at EDP Renewables. And with that, I am going to pass control to Mark Salvo.
Thank you, Shana. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you all for attending our presentation today. It is a privilege to visit with you and with this accomplished panel on this important topic. I am Mark Salvo. I am with the Oregon Natural Desert Association, presenting to you from Smoky Bend, Oregon today. We are praying for rain on Thursday. As Shana noted, I was also formerly with Defenders of Wildlife, which explains by at least some of the slides you see today originated with that organization and the work that I got to do there with our renewable energy and wildlife team. I have been asked to lay the foundation for the informative presentations to come. This includes overviewing the western grouse species of interest and the regulatory treatment of them as regards wind energy development. So without further ado, what western grouse are we talking about? They are large, sensitive, imperiled ground nesting grouse species quintessential to the western landscapes they inhabit. These species are valued enormously for their ecological, historic, cultural, and economic contributions to the American West. Here are, in fact, two pictured species of sage grouse, greater sage grouse on your left, Gunnison sage grouse on your right. They are distinguishable as two different species, the one on the right being, in fact, only 2/3 the size of the one on the left and occupying a very small habitat or range in primarily southwestern Colorado. Because of its limited range and other factors, wind energy development is not typically considered an influence or even threat to this species. And so for the purposes of our presentation today, we won't worry about it any further. Shifting to prairie chickens. Again, the prairie chicken on your left is your lesser prairie chicken. The prairie chicken on your right, greater prairie chicken. Distinguishable in a number of different ways. You can see, in fact, that there are different coloring in the birds and in their air sacs. The greater prairie chicken is in fact a larger bird than the lesser prairie chicken. Greater prairie chickens primarily inhabit the upper Midwest, where they have a larger range, have greater numbers, and where wind energy development might be an impact on the species. It's not considered to be a major threat, at least according to the literature today. And so for our purposes, we'll focus on lesser prairie chicken going forward and the myriad impacts from a variety of different land uses and resource development on that species. And then finally, there are 6 subspecies of sharp-tailed grouse, a 7th, unfortunately, that went extinct, that inhabit western landscapes. This is the Columbian sharp-tailed grouse. It's probably the most sensitive of the 6 subspecies that occur west-wide. Plain sharp-tailed grouse might be another one. But again, given the habitat requirements, somewhat limited range of these species, what's important for their persistence and where wind energy development is likely to occur, renewable energy is not considered a threat to these sharp-tailed grouse species. Now, what the heck is this? It is a hybrid of a greater sage grouse and a sharp-tailed grouse. It is not our concern here today, but it's interesting to see, and perhaps a reminder that Mother Nature, and in this case, a boy sage grouse and a girl sharp-tailed grouse, will ultimately determine who and what occupies these western landscapes. This is a fairly rare occurrence, but does happen, particularly in the Dakotas, where greater sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse range overlap. By the way, you can see some of the interesting and distinguishing features of each species presented in this confusing looking bird. And this is even a rarer occurrence. This is a leucistic greater sage grouse. So it's not albino, because there is some bit of coloring in the feathering, in the air sacs, and in the eye cone, but it's still fascinating to consider. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, why not? We're in the midst of a pandemic. We are suffering tough economic times, and you deserve it. By the way, we'll ask Chad LeBeau later about the potential life strategy for a bird that literally glows white on a landscape that looks green and brown most of the year. Now back to serious business and greater sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken. These range maps depict the current and historic ranges for each one of these species. The green shades representing occupied and historic range for greater sage grouse. The yellow and orange shades of the same for lesser prairie chicken. These are windy landscapes. They are also underlain by billions of dollars of petrochemicals. They are popular places to develop homes and businesses, roads, transmission lines, pipelines, fence lines, and other incursions that have over decades eliminated, fragmented, and degraded millions of acres of sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken habitat. Now, for reference, the purple and lavender colors appearing on this map are current and historic range for Gunnison sage grouse. Included here just to see where they fit in the western landscape. It's also important to note that Gunnison sage grouse is the only western grouse species that is currently protected under the Endangered Species Act. None of the other species that we've reviewed or will review are federally protected. Now, land ownership is going to be key to understanding the different regulatory treatments afforded to greater sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken. As you can appreciate from these graphics, 67% of greater sage grouse occupied range is managed by federal agencies, the Bureau of Land Management being the most important of those, Forest Service, but also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through its refuges system and the National Park Service. So the federal government is key to conserving and recovering sage grouse across its 11-state range. By comparison, 95% of remaining or occupied lesser prairie chicken range is private land. And so the management and conservation strategies deployed there are necessarily different to help provide for conservation needs while also accommodating private property rights throughout the limited range of this species. As per the previous slide, greater sage-grouse still occupy about 50% of the remaining range. But again, I'm in Bend, Oregon today, choking on smoke, some of it greater sage-grouse habitat going up in flames. By comparison, lesser prairie chicken distribution is much more restricted, about 16% of the historic distribution. Their numbers much fewer, and therefore perhaps even greater conservation concern. So let's start off with, I should go back and say that there are an array of conservation strategies, plans, guidelines, state and local restrictions that influence and affect how wind energy development and other development, resource use and land use occur within these western grouse ranges. But I'm going to focus my remarks on two strategies in particular, one for each species. Both of them range wide in their application. So now moving on to greater sage-grouse and federal land ownership. A greater sage-grouse current range actually covers pieces and parts of 68 BLM districts and resource areas. And so, as I mentioned before, the Bureau of Land Management is key to conserving greater sage-grouse in its habitat. In 2011, the Obama administration launched an unprecedented effort to develop and implement measures to conserve and recover greater sage-grouse on this 67% of sage-grouse remaining or occupied range. They did so by subdividing the effort into 15 sub-regions, many roughly following state boundaries. Each of these planning processes addressed wind energy development independently, much to the chagrin and frustration of those of us who are trying to participate in that planning process. Most of those sub-regional plans prohibited wind energy development in sage-grouse priority habitat areas. Those habitat areas determined to be most important to the persistence of the species. And depending on how you measure those, that's between 40 and 60 million acres across the sagebrush steppe where sage-grouse still persist. The Oregon sub-regional strategy only requires managers to avoid developing renewable energy resources in priority habitat. It's not restricted in our state. And the several plans in Wyoming also differed in that they required that industry first prove or demonstrate that development won't negatively affect greater sage-grouse before proposing development in core habitat areas. This is an interesting and perplexing requirement, given that no other land use or development type is required to demonstrate that it won't negatively affect the species, but that is what is currently included in federal conservation plans for sage-grouse in the state. Now, the treatment of wind energy development has not changed in these plans, even as the Trump administration has been revising and rolling back protections for greater sage-grouse, including, perhaps ironically, from fossil fuel development. Now, by comparison, lesser prairie chicken range-wide conservation is primarily a state concern. And with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency developing the range-wide conservation plan for this species. It is a mix of mostly voluntary management recommendations and mitigation measures. It supports to some degree market-based approaches to mitigating and conserving the species. Again, in due consideration to the fact that 95% of the species habitat are private lands. Like the BLM plans for greater sage-grouse, the range-wide conservation strategy for lesser prairie chicken identifies priority habitat areas for the species, which is essentially all remaining occupied habitat. The strategy generally advises against developing resources, including wind energy, in those occupied habitat areas, but otherwise recommends buffering prairie chicken breeding sites, or WECs, by 667 meters where wind energy projects might be developed within those occupied areas. Now, like the BLM plans, the strategy has been criticized by some for failing to direct development away from key habitat areas. But I also understand that the wind energy industry, both in an interest to conserve lesser prairie chicken and their range, but also to perhaps avoid a regulatory delay in developing and implementing projects, are essentially just sidestepping or not proposing new wind energy development in these core habitat areas. In addition to the myriad threats affecting western grouse species, climate change is becoming perhaps an overriding concern given its many impacts on the species itself and the habitats that they occupy. And so really, renewable energy development is a conservation strategy for western grouse, greater sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken, and literally the tens of thousands of other species that depend on these landscapes. So I'm looking forward to our panel today, our discussion going forward, and learning how best to develop wind energy and other renewable energy resources within greater sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken range, and on the high plateaus of the broad plains, western plains, to help mitigate for climate change effects and therefore provide for perhaps a better future for these species and the people, communities, and economies that depend on these regions. So thank you very much for your attendance today, and it is now my pleasure to introduce John Lloyd of the American Wind and Wildlife Institute with our next presentation.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mark. That was outstanding. I learned a lot right there. So let me see if I can remember how it works. All right. I think you can all see the slides there. So I am speaking with you all from my basement in Vermont. I never thought I would begin a talk by saying that, but here we are. I just wanted to give a shout out to all of you. I'm sure many of you are out in the West, and we're all thinking of you and hope you're staying safe out there with all of this madness. So as Mark suggested, today I'm going to talk with you a little bit about an initiative that I've been involved with along with several colleagues to try to summarize the state of the science when it comes to wind energy and prairie grouse. And Mark did an awesome job of setting this up, so I get to skip ahead a little bit. The one thing we call these prairie grouse, which is wrong for a couple of reasons, but throughout the talk when I mention prairie grouse, I'm really talking about those same 5 species that Mark went through. And again, without much attention to Gunnison sage grouse, because right now wind energy is not really at all a consideration from a conservation standpoint. So what this whole effort was really an inquiry into what we know, what we don't know, and what we thought we needed to know about the interactions between prairie grouse and wind energy. And this whole process involved 2 pieces. One is this review of the literature and the synthesis of what we know. That's what I'll talk about today. There's also an ongoing conversation among stakeholders about trying to identify research priorities and figuring out how we're going to address them. I won't be talking about that today. Just a note on process, I want to acknowledge upfront that all of this work depended on the joint writing and research and conclusion making of all of these folks, including Chad, who we're lucky to have here today as well. But I just want to thank them all for spending the better part of a year with me working on this, and also to Bethany Straw for her support of this all the way. So let me give you a little bit of a roadmap for where we want to go over the next 12 minutes or so. I'm going to quickly start with just a justification for why we did this. Why are we all here thinking about prairie grouse and wind energy? Review the studies that have been done at wind energy facilities and give you a sense of what's the basis for our conclusions. And then I'll jump right into sort of the heart of the matter, which is what do we know? And I'll look at what we know from studies at wind facilities, but also what could we learn perhaps from studies at other kinds of infrastructure, like oil and gas, for example. And then I'll just wrap up quickly with some thoughts about what comes next. So why do we need this review of the science? Why are we here? Again, Mark sort of teed this up perfectly, which is that we sort of have this equation that we have the potential for extensive exposure of these 5 species to wind energy development. So I put the combined range of all those species in the hash marked polygon on this map. And areas that have potentially high value wind resources are shown in the light gray shading. So what we have is we have the overlap of these 2 features, and we have the potential for impacts. We don't understand what those impacts are likely to be very well at all. And so to us, this led to the idea that we needed some kind of accessible summary that could help us better assess risk, inform our conservation efforts, and guide us as a community of practice towards doing research that was really going to pay off and allow us to effectively conserve grouse while we're building out the non-polluting energy sources that we know we're going to need to do. Okay, so that's sort of why we did it. Let me quickly walk through the studies that have been done, and then we'll get into what we found. So just start by acknowledging that the empirical foundation is incomplete. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. These are all of the facilities where studies of prairie grouse ecology have been conducted, all of the wind facilities in North America where we've done work on grouse. There's 5 of them. You can see where they are on the far left, how big they are, the species studied. I'll just point out too that there are, for most species, we really have no information. One study of sharp-tailed grouse, but focusing on nest ecology. Landscape context for these facilities, and then what kind of experimental design the authors used. Just an abbreviation here, because I know we're watching out for acronyms. BACI, BACI, before after control impact, sort of the gold standard of impact assessment study designs, as are before after gradients. So this is the basis of really everything that we think we know about wind energy and grouse right here. The footnotes do refer to references that are at the end of the slide deck for those of you that are interested in following up. So there's 3 things that I want to point out because it's important in how we think about these conclusions that I'll share with you, and they should give us some pause. These are sort of caveats. One is that there's a fundamental lack of replication. We have only 1 species, that's greater prairie chicken, that's been studied at more than 1 place. And we know from any other kinds of investigations of environmental change that it's really hard to generalize about effects in one place to effects in another place. So we need to be cautious because we really haven't done that much work here. Secondly, a lot of these studies have relied on pretty short time series. Most of them are on less than 4 years of data. But we know especially with sage grouse, but to a lesser extent with prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse, effects may take a long time to manifest. These populations, they may not change, you may not see change immediately. So there is a question of whether the long-term effects are going to line up with what we see in the short term. And then finally, as I pointed out, we really don't have pre-construction data, but for these 2 facilities. And it's difficult to say with certainty the effects of any environmental change without knowing what the conditions were like beforehand. So without pre-construction data, hard for us to develop robust conclusions. So with all of those caveats, what do we know so far? There are 2 main findings, and I'll just detail them here quickly, and then I'll go into a little bit more depth in the next few slides. The first is that we don't find any evidence for consistent, significant adverse impacts on demographic rates. like survival or reproduction. So we don't see a lot, we really don't see any evidence that that demographic rates are depressed for populations that are exposed to wind energy facilities. We do, though, see behavioral responses in the form of reduced use of space near wind energy infrastructure for some species in some locations. All right, so a little bit more detail about these two. So demography, again, we don't see big responses. We've looked at adult survival and sort of and nest survival, the reproduction component of it. The one thing I want to point out is that the top two bullets under each one of these are the results from studies that use these sort of gold standard experimental designs. The bullets that follow that are studies that didn't have pre-construction data. There's still valuable information, but I just want to point out, if we're thinking about what do we have the most confidence in, it's going to be from results stemming from studies with pre-construction data. So for adult survival, when we looked at female greater prairie chickens at the facility in Kansas, we actually see survival is higher following construction and initiation of operations at the facility. Not clear why that is, but that's what we see. Chad has shown in two of his projects, not with the benefit of pre-construction data, but looking after the fact that adult female survival for sage grouse, greater sage grouse, and lesser prairie chickens aren't related to proximity to a turbine. So no evidence that being near wind energy infrastructure imposes a short-term survival cost, at least. Nest survival is really the same story. The only nuance there is that some of Chad's earlier work at 7 Mile Hill with sage grouse did find evidence that in some years nest survival was lower, closer to turbines, but that isn't always the case. A longer-term data set showed that that pattern wasn't always consistent. So in general, we can say that short-term demographic rates appear stable. Where we see a more consistent response is there is some evidence of avoidance of turbines for some species and some seasons. We've got two lines of evidence here that are shown on the slide. On the left is looking at how males respond in one case, and on the right is looking at how females respond. Pointing out, these are both results from that facility in Kansas that had before-after control impact design. So these are from the same place, one looking at male response, one looking at females. So in the case of the males, the finding is that lek abandonment, and Mark mentioned leks are these communal breeding grounds, lek abandonment increased with proximity to a turbine in this study. So males were more likely to abandon their traditional leks, which they go to year in, year out, when those leks were closer to a turbine. And that figure there shows along the x-axis, the distance to a turbine, along the y-axis, the probability that lek persisted over the course of the study. The little circles on the figure are actually the leks, and if they're along the 0 line, those leks didn't make it. If they're along the 1 line, they survive for the duration of the study. What you can see is that some leks near turbines do fine, but in general, if we look at leks that were abandoned during the course of the study, they tend to be closer to turbines. And that line shows sort of the average response. We see that the effect is most pronounced within about 3 kilometers of the turbine. So that's males. On the right-hand side is looking at is sort of an illustration of how females in the same population responded to the construction of the facility. Those polygons show home ranges. The brighter areas are places they use more intensively, core areas. The darker areas are parts of their home range that they didn't use much at all. And the finding here is not that the birds abandon the area, but these females tend to shift their use of space away from the turbine. So they'll still be found sometimes near the turbine, but they're not using that location as intensively as they would have in the absence of the turbine. We also see that their home range size increases as well. So these are sort of signs, behavioral signs, that the birds are perceiving some element of this infrastructure, and we don't know what, as a source of disturbance. I also, not from a Bakke design, but again, some more of Chad's work has shown a similar pattern with female sage grouse reducing use of areas during the brood rearing period when there's more surface occupancy of wind energy infrastructure. The So because we have so little sort of firsthand information from wind facilities, there's been a lot of interest in saying, what could we glean from all of the studies we've done on oil and gas or roads or power lines? How could that inform our efforts to assess risk and mitigate it when it comes to wind energy? The short answer is that as a group, we are extremely reluctant to suggest that you can take specifics from other forms of disturbance and apply it to wind. There are some general rules that we thought you could take home though. First of which is density of infrastructure matters, and we see this pretty well with oil and gas, that the effects increase as the density of infrastructure on the landscape increases. So what this means is that as we look at the response of birds to an individual facility, that's one thing and that's important, but we also need to be thinking about how are populations exposed to different intensities of development faring, and that those two things may be slightly different. Time lags are the rule. And again, from oil and gas, we know that population responses can take up to 10 years to manifest. So we're going to need either longer term studies, or we're going to need to return to some of these facilities that we studied in the past and see whether our estimate of short-term effects lines up with what's happening currently. The last piece is just to think about all the infrastructure associated with development. We know that roads and above ground power lines can have deleterious effects on some of these species in some cases. And so to the extent that those are part of infrastructure development, being aware of that and recognizing that they too will contribute to the response of the grouse. Okay, so let me just quickly wrap up here before I turn it over to Chad. This is some of the big take homes, I think. Based on what we've seen, at least in the short run, grouse and wind can certainly coexist in the same landscape. There are, however, some really important uncertainties that we're going to need to address, and they're going to become even more pressing as build out progresses in this region. To address that, we will need a pretty strategic program of research that's going to have to happen quickly, because we know that the urgency to deal with this climate crisis is only growing, and that we're going to be developing more renewable energy. So figuring out these uncertainties now is going to be important. These are some of the big questions that we think we need to answer in the short run. All of that said, we're also completely cognizant of the fact that decisions about permits, about investing in new projects are going to be made in the absence of complete information. This isn't a call to wait for the scientists to figure everything out, but what it is a call for is to be as adaptive and thoughtful as we can. So we're going to need to do our best to predict effects of new projects, avoid, minimize, mitigate them, and then monitor the responses to see whether or not what we think is true is actually true in the field, whether our conservation measures are working. And with that, I'm going to close it, and here are some people I wanted to thank. Again, references are all on the rest of the deck, and I think up next is going to be Chad LeBeau. So Chad, I'm going to turn it over to you, I think.
Great, thanks.
Before Chad begins, I think we're going to launch our first trivia question. I will send that out right now. It looks like we've got the majority of responses are for 1.25 miles. There's about 40% of people responding with that first answer. I'm gonna close the poll. How did we do, Chad?
All right, well, thank you. Looking at the audience view here to get things rolling. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the good discussion from John and Mark. I think they did a good job of teeing up the next next discussion point where we talk about there is a need. We recognize wind energy is coming. We recognize wind energy overlaps a lot of our grouse populations in North America. And how can we develop to minimize impacts to these populations? So just a brief introduction of where I'd like to go with this presentation is talk a little bit about the methodologies behind all of those studies that that Mark and John have presented, and kind of the overall strategy of how we can develop responsibly. So first, utilize best available information. As John said, there is a few studies out there, but it is some information to use, and we should take advantage of that when we are evaluating potential effects of a project to wind energy. It's important to understand the extent of the population, so understand what the extent of the potential affected population, how great of an impact are we expecting. It's important to predict the direct and indirect effects. It's important to minimize, mitigate, and then monitor impacts, and then take it a step further. What John was mentioning is incorporate those results into an adaptive conservation framework that could be used for the next project that is going to be developed in grouse habitat. So I think it's really important that we recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and ideally, that's hard for planning. It's hard for developers. It's hard for managers to make recommendations when we don't have these one-size-fits-all. And so when we're talking about all these studies, we need more studies. We need more studies. And replication, it's going to be difficult to achieve that, especially when we have facilities in different habitats and different configurations. The picture on the top left there is a facility in relatively intact habitats. And then on the facility on the right, there's kind of a mix. So they're kind of on the edge of fragmented habitat, but then also some suitable habitat nearby. And then down below, relatively a fragmented landscape. So the impacts are going to be different, and we're not going to be able to design a one-size-fits-all for species, for different populations. Some populations are migratory, some are not. And so I'm really advocating that projects be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, because as we collect more data and as we get more information, I still think that there is this unique characteristics about each project that needs to be addressed at an individual level. So utilize best available information. As John went through there's a number of studies that have become available to us to use, and we should use that. And we also should use what we know about grouse in response to other anthropogenic features. They are well-studied species. I do think that wind energy is another source of an anthropogenic feature that could fragment the landscape. And so we should be able to draw some sort of comparisons between the two on just the habitat fragmentation alone. There's numerous other resources available to us when we're evaluating what the potential effects of a project are onto a grouse population. Remote sensing, we have the access of Google Earth of really high level imagery where we can tease out where is habitat and what is not. Plenty of state databases, a lot of state agencies, wildlife agencies have made it a priority to monitor and inventory their grouse populations. And so every year there's a big effort to understand and understand trends and objectives. And so the state wildlife agencies have a wealth of information that can be used to understand what the expected impacts could be. John touched on this a little bit, but understanding the extent of the affected population is important. If we have a facility that is near 2 leks, is that the same impact as a facility in a cluster of leks? And And the answer is no. And so we need to understand where the birds are using, how are they using it, and how the position of the facility on the landscape would affect those leks. And so getting a good, thorough understanding of potentially extent of that population, because we are interested in what is the overall effect to the grouse population. You know, all those studies that have been done are looking at various mechanisms that drive that. So nest survival, displacement, are they selecting habitats away from the facility, and the thought is that they select away from there, then they're lower quality habitat, so then that reduces survival. And so there's a bunch of different mechanisms: brood survival, female survival, male survival, lek attendance. All those mechanisms add up to population growth or decline or stabilization, and that's kind of that metric that we really want to understand. The facility is not impacting nest survival, but they are forcing birds away. Okay, well, how is that affecting the population? You have one facility on the landscape, you add 2 or 3 more, how does that affect the population? So again, understanding these dynamics and how the population is responding without wind energy is going to be important as you start adding more facilities on the landscape. So once we identify the extent of the population in our landscape, now let's figure out predict the direct and indirect impacts, because this information is needed to help implement minimization measures, understand the mitigation necessary to offset or provide a net conservation gain. And so a few ways to do this is identifying concentration areas. And all these grouse species are lek-centric. We all understand that they use the majority of their life history at various distances from leks. And so that's always a good place to start, is identifying all historical leks and search for any unknown leks within the survey area, because populations do fluctuate, and a thorough understanding of that is important. Those can be done by ground counts, driving, or aerial lek surveys, and then also in those hard to travel areas in Idaho and Nevada, infrared has been a good technique to count individuals. Also look at brooding habitat. You could do flush counts where you can flush a female and she'll behave differently when she has brood, and you can determine that. Identifying winter habitat. Winter habitat seems to be an important driver of population change. So identifying those concentration areas is important, and this mostly applies to sage grouse because they do transition between winter, summer, and breeding. Those can be done by driving track counts, pellet counts, and aerial abundance surveys. Another key component is identifying habitat. And as you Google grouse and habitat, you'll have a bunch of different conservation plans that define habitat slightly different or pretty close. It varies from species to species. But what we do know is that, in my experience, it's easier to identify what is not habitat, and that seems to be a good way to start, because we do know, as I mentioned, grouse can move pretty far from leks, and we can't really focus in on habitat around a lek. So if we want to identify what is not habitat, we want to look at existing anthropogenic features, because there's plenty of research out there that shows that grouse avoid those structures. Can also help us look at the level of existing habitat fragmentation, because there are thresholds that the grouse cannot tolerate. Cultivated lands and non-native areas, and this is an example of where we could look at what is not habitat versus what could potentially be. So once we identify the impacts and where we expect the facility to cause the greatest impact, we can provide some recommendations to minimize that. So again, if we have a thorough inventory of what is out there, we could side away from concentration areas, leks, brooding areas, winter concentration areas. We can site a non-habitat. So if we focus our locations in areas where we don't expect grouse to use, that seems to be a good minimization measures. And then once we go through all of that, and there's still some potential for unavoidable impacts, mitigating those will help sustain the populations for future generations. So monitoring. So we've now did our best to inform where the facility goes, and now I'm recommending that we conduct monitoring to evaluate the impacts from that facility, even if it is in grouse range and maybe not really close into high density of leks. It still provides some information that we can use to inform future facilities. So we want to conduct monitoring, and I'll go into what that might look like. But we can incorporate those results in an adaptive management framework. So when one facility conducts a research study, we take those results and we put it into a framework that can be used to inform the next study. And then the study after that incorporates those minimization measures, and they look at the impacts of how that went, and we form it for the next study. So it's a constant informing. As John pointed out, we can't really wait for the research to catch up, because there likely is not going to be a point where we're going to say, yes, we have enough research to do this. And so it really needs to be done on an adaptive framework here. This picture on the right is a relative probability of use map of lesser prairie chickens in Kansas at the Cimarron Bend. This is female breeding, and you can see that we predicted higher use in and around the facility where grasslands occurred, which was to be expected there. So to do monitoring, there is the expensive telemetry study. As John pointed out, studies with 5 years are considered short term, and we need to extend that to beyond 5 years. And to do that, there's the telemetry studies, which are pretty expensive, where we go out and we capture individuals, we put little GPS backpacks on, and we monitor their use of the landscape. We can do habitat assessments, see how habitat has changed, because it may be a fire. As we all know, fires are impacting landscape right now. Is it really the facility, or was it a fire? So we want to be able to monitor those changes. Lek surveys, I hope that we get to that point at some point, because they do provide a good index of overall population health. And so if we can correlate our Lek survey results to our telemetry study results, then maybe in the future projects we can just rely on Lek surveys. And I also think it's important to look at cumulative effects. And so right now all the studies are looking at one facility, but we're starting to see studies or projects expand just on market conditions or development conditions out of our control. And so it'd be interesting to see how cumulative effects turn out. And the video on the right is our Cimarron bed, and this is just May through June movements. And so we can get some pretty detailed information, which is pretty interesting. And these are the GPS backpacks that you all may be interested in, is that we fit them on grouse on their back, and they collect locations every 15 to 30 minutes, and then we can view them from our offices here in Laramie, and then we can follow up on nest and survival. So it's pretty great technology right now, and units are getting cheaper, and so it is becoming more cost effective to do telemetry studies. So in conclusion, a case-by-case evaluation. I know we talked about a review of the science. We talked about little information is out there, but again, from what we know on grouse and other anthropogenic features that have been well studied, it really is a case-by-case situation where a grouse population may respond differently at one location versus another. And so I think it's really important that we continue to focus on that and not necessarily have blanket conservation measures that are applicable to all projects, because that's likely not the case. Existing data and additional data collection may be necessary to understand potential impacts. And again, this gets at our adaptive framework. If one facility can collect a little bit of data, that's going to help inform future facilities. So I think it's really important that we collect all the necessary information, and we use that to inform future projects. Understanding the extent of the potentially affected population, again, is important to understand how the project is affecting population level impacts. We can predict the direct and indirect impacts from what we know. We can adjust siting to minimize impacts to the best of our ability. And then we can understand that, yes, there will be some impacts that could be mitigated for to conserve the local or the regional grouse populations. And then monitor these impacts to incorporate into the future grouse conservation plans, or again, going back to that adaptive management framework. And some of the challenges associated with the monitoring and opportunities of improvement, as John pointed out, the ideal study design is that before and after the study design. And you notice in that table, there was a lot of afters. Well, that's ideally we would be able to collect 2 years of or multiple years of pre-construction data, and then the facility comes in, and then we are able to monitor after that. Well, that's not really how the development works. There's different factors of influencing that Christy's going to talk a little bit about, but those are just some of the challenges that are difficult to capture in our grouse world. Is we can go out and we can start sage grouse or grouse studies in 2 years of pre-construction data collection, and then for some reason the project dies, and we spent some money collecting a lot of information that is not very useful now. So planning has been a challenge for understanding these impacts. Another challenge is, as Mark pointed out, is that wind energy is precluded in sage grouse world in these higher density areas, and so for us to understand the impacts, we need facilities where we can actually monitor the impact. And so what I don't want to see is us behind the game, where we start maybe a change of the pen in the conservation plans of the states or agencies then change, and we're struggling to catch up. And so I think it's really important that we start thinking about monitoring and doing these studies in areas where we expect development to occur. And then when the development does occur, then we can go ahead and monitor the effect afterwards. So with that, thanks for letting me join, and happy to answer any questions after the webinar. And I think we're going to move it on to Christy. So take it away, Christy.
All right, thank you. Okay. All right, can you see my screen?
We can, Christy. And would you like me to put up your polling question now?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to launch that now. All right, it looks like we've got the majority of responses are WWRF, which I believe is the correct answer.
It is.
And Christy, I'll close that poll and you can get started.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So hello, everybody. Greetings from Houston, Texas, and I hope everybody is doing well out there. Wanted to thank all my other colleagues for their presentations, because they set me up pretty well for today. So you'll be hearing some reinforcing themes, I think. I also wanted to thank NREL and Defenders for the opportunity to provide my industry perspective today. I'm going to say we a lot, but when I say we, I'm really mean me. I know a lot of my industry colleagues share a lot of these same views. Obviously, I can't speak for the whole entire industry. So again, when I say we a lot, I'm talking about things from my perspective and EDPR's experience.
Christy.
So with that, yes.
So sorry to interrupt you. Unfortunately, your slides are no longer showing.
Oh, okay.
So I'm actually going to take away your presenter privileges and make you a presenter again. And hopefully we'll be able to get that to work.
Perfect. No problem. All right, I just saw that show my screen. Okay, hopefully.
There you go. Perfect. Sorry about the interruption.
All right. No, no problem. Okay. Give me 1 second. Things are not moving. All right. All right. Let me know if there's any issues. I'm gonna move on to the next slide then. All right, perfect. So to start things off, I thought it might be helpful to depict the ranges of the various grouse species and how they relate to the wind areas in the U.S. So what you're seeing here before you, hopefully, in this in your screen is a wind data map from NREL, and these areas, bluish areas, represent the areas of highest wind potential in the U.S. So now I'm going to overlay the different grouse species ranges. We're not addressing the denizens as my colleagues have explained before. We really don't have a lot of overlap with wind. So here we go. We have the sharp-tailed grouse, the greater sage grouse, the greater prairie chicken, and the green one is the lesser prairie chicken. So as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the grouse ranges and the potential wind development areas, particularly here in the central U.S. where the highest wind potential is. So essentially, this is why this is a big issue for us and why it's an important issue for us. So why is the grouse issue so difficult for the wind industry? I've been working with wind and wildlife issues for years now, and this is still an issue that I can't completely wrap my head around. In many ways, it's more difficult than the bat issue or the eagle issue that you guys hear us talking so often about. So one of the things is the regulatory uncertainty, which some of my other colleagues alluded to. And since all the grouse are different, I'm going to just use the lesser prairie chicken as an example. I think we all recognize that there's been a lot of uncertainty with the listing decisions for the lesser prairie chicken. There's been delisting, litigation. And so there's really been a lack of clarity, and particularly a lack of clarity in decision timelines. So, to me, one of the scariest things in my mind is having a project that is fully developed in lesser prairie chicken habitat where we've been coordinating with the agencies. We're ready to go to construction, and then all of a sudden, there's a huge regulatory change, and now I need to deal with ESA listing, potential permits, timeline delays, and more cost. So again, it's very difficult to try to plan ahead with the regulatory uncertainty. Another example from my experience with the sage grouse particularly has been just the way that the states have been handling sage grouse. For example, in Wyoming several years ago, they implemented a sage grouse core area strategy, particularly to preclude a listing of the sage grouse. And so I had a project that was pretty far along in the development process. We were pretty far along in the permitting for that project, and then the sage grouse strategy was implemented. And unfortunately for us, our project was right in the middle of a core area. And despite, trying to work very closely with the regulatory agencies, we weren't able to find a path forward for that project, and it hasn't been able to move on. So again, this regulatory uncertainty can have really detrimental effects for projects. The next one is the need for more scientific data, and this has been talked about a little bit already today, but there isn't a lot of data specific to wind impacts. And traditionally, studies relating to grouse and other sources of energy, particularly oil and gas, have been used. And we really don't feel that's a good, we don't view that as being an appropriate use of that data, because these energy sources are different. They can have some things in common, but they don't have the same impacts. So using those data can be problematic for us. However, we are making some good strides in getting some more data. I think Chad and John alluded to this. There's been a multi-year lesser prairie chicken study in Kansas that has come out with some good results from our standpoint, where there wasn't any evidence that the wind energy facility was having negative impacts on lesser prairie chicken. So we understand that's just one project, one study, but it does give me hope that wind within lesser prairie chicken habitat can coexist. So we need to get more data to help support that. The next item that makes it this issue very hard for us, is the cost and the time to conduct research studies. So again, this has been talked a little bit about, but from our perspective, I mean, the time that it takes and the cost that it takes and the time that it takes actually for us to get the results to be able to use is very problematic. So traditionally, the gold standard for these studies has been the before and after control impact study, the BACI study. And again, these can take a long time. One of the big issues that I've seen with conducting Grouse studies has been just the availability of host sites. Chad alluded a little bit to this, but to be able to find a host site that really could give us good results is very difficult. One, because we need sites that are in high density of grouse, and right now, for the most part, we're not developing in those areas for many reasons. And so it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. And so, you need various studies, various sites to be studied pre-construction. So then at least you have a good chance that one of them will go to post-construction. Not all the sites that are developed actually go into operations. There's many factors that preclude projects from moving on in the development process. So this can be a real problem for us, an impediment for us. We've had great scientific minds think of other ways, other study plans that we could use other than the BACI, but we've found out that no matter what, some of these studies still take a long time and they could cost a lot of money. So getting the data that we need to make the decisions can be very hard. And then the last issue that I'll talk about today, why this is so difficult to us, is really the high mitigation cost. So traditionally, the way that impacts to grouse, and particularly right now I'm going to be speaking about the lesser prairie chicken, the way these impacts are mitigating is really through land preservation for the most part. So conservation easements that we put in place in perpetuity. And, these take a lot of work. They take a lot of work coordinating with the landowners, with different land trusts, and they can be, very expensive as well. Compounding the issue is just the high mitigation acres that are recommended based on the impact assessments. And so you're coupling high mitigation acres with high costs, then that really, again, can have a detrimental effect for the projects. Regarding the lesser prairie chicken, again, I'm only aware of one approved mitigation bank. And again, the cost per acre for the banking are again, they're not low, and really that has to do, my understanding is with, the high requirements that those banks have in order to get approved. And so again, I think one of the things we need to work through is how to look at different mitigation opportunities for the wind industry. So what have we done in terms of industry efforts? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is our long history of funding and supporting research. What I mean by supporting is, again, by volunteering our sites to become host sites, whether they're in the development stage or in the operation stage. And this does take a lot of work on the part of the company. It takes many teams and the on-site team to just be able to fully support the researchers on site. We've also we've supported funding through the Sage Grouse Collaborative, through the NWCC, the Grassland Collaborative that has done greater prairie chicken research for many years in a site in Kansas that there's been a lot of scientific data that has been published in peer-reviewed journals coming out of that collaborative. And then again, the recent lesser prairie chicken research that I mentioned earlier, that was partially funded by individual project companies, but also partially funded through the Wind Wildlife Research Fund. And for those of you that don't know what the WWRF is, which I think a lot of you do because you got, I think, the poll correct, it's the Wind Wildlife Research Fund. Is an industry-led effort that's been around for about 2 years that provides funding for wind and wildlife research. So this normally right now is being focused on bats, eagles, and of course grouse. The other industry effort that we were very active on is the Great Plains Wind Energy HCP effort. So this really started by a group of industry representatives that worked for many, many years in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state agencies on a regional HTP that essentially covered the Whooping Crane corridor, but also covered Lesser Prairie chicken range, and it also covered 2 other avian species. So within that framework, the industry representatives pursued a science-based approach to impact assessment that we felt would result in great benefits to the Lesser Prairie chicken, but also allow growth of carbon-reducing renewable energy. So we worked on this project for many, many, many years, probably over a decade, but unfortunately have not been able to find a solution that works for both the industry and the agencies. So, you know, from my perspective, this has been really tough because we feel that we have perhaps lost on some of the conservation benefit for the Lesser Prairie chicken that would have occurred through broader implementation of the HTP and ITP if that process had been finalized. And then finally, there's voluntary mitigation. You know, even though these 4 species are not federally listed and recognizing that they have different statuses within the states, you know, a lot of projects have moved on within habitat of these species, and companies have recognized that this is an important issue and have chosen to voluntarily mitigate or do conservation projects for these species. From our own experience here at EDPR, we just finished a multi-year grassland conservation project in Kansas that has conserved and put into conservation easement thousands of acres, and this was done for the greater prairie chicken. Yep, sorry, I went too fast. Oh no. Shayna, I lost the presentation. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Christy, and we can see the slide that says path forward.
It does look
Okay.
like
Yeah,
your camera's frozen.
Okay, yeah, my computer just did a weird thing, so I apologize for that. But I can, apologies for that. Don't know what happened. It just froze on me. Well, let me see if I can, I don't want to delay the presentation, so let me see if I can do this from memory. So I think right now we're talking about the path forward. So I think it's very imperative for us to find a path forward, and the wind industry is really excited to work collaboratively with all different stakeholders to make that happen. So, and I'm sorry, Shane, I'm probably going to ask you to remind me what's on the slide because it's not in front of me. So I think the first bullet was continue to collaborate with, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You got it, you got it.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Yeah, so we think it's very important to continue to collaborate with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the state agencies, and with the environmental organizations to come up with minimization and mitigation strategies that would be, that won't render a project unfeasible. And I think it is also very important for us to make these decisions based on the best available science that we have. Another thing that we also need, as I alluded to before, is the regulatory certainty. So this is a very hard one for me to wrap my head around because we obviously, none of us want these species to be listed in the future. But at the same time, it is very hard for us to manage the kind of the state-by-state regulations, and oftentimes the restrictions that are put on wind energy projects are even more rigorous than other energy sources. I think Mark alluded this to before a little bit on the BLM plans. And so, you know, I think what would be a win-win for the wind industry and for everybody else is if we could come up, we could have some regulatory certainty and can have some cost-effective mitigation and minimization, and obviously preclude a listing for any of these species. And finally, I think we do need to continue the research. I think the research is is very important. You know, I alluded a little bit to the fact that, you know, conducting projects is sometimes hard because of host sites. It's very important that we have the buy-in of the different stakeholders, particularly the wildlife agencies, because it's very hard for us to think of a situation where we're spending a lot of time and money on a study, and then at the end still not be in agreement with the study results. So we definitely want the buy-in from the regulators, and this may also entail some hard decisions. I talked a little bit about not having really good sites to study, and so, you know, there may need to be an agreement for development to move forward in some areas that have been traditionally considered off limits, so that we can have the best study results and be able to make good decisions in the future. So I think that's really something that we need to consider as well. And then I'm trying to think of the final point. Sorry, I'm still flying blind here. Apologies.
Christy, we have your slides up on the screen now. And your third bullet on this page was to continue to support research related to grouse and wind energy interactions, need buy-in from wildlife agencies.
Okay. Well, I probably, sorry again, my computer froze, so I think I covered all the points. I think the next slide shows my contact information. If anybody has more questions later, please contact me. And again, I want to thank NREL and Defenders for the opportunity to give my perspective. And I think I toss it over to you, Shayna, for the Q&A portion.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christy. And I would like to welcome back all of our presenters to join us for our Q&A session. Let me just navigate to that. One moment. Thank you again to everyone for participating. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I am going to start our questions in a moment once Christy has joined us again as well. All right. And
I am on the, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Christy, are you with us? Perfect.
I am on the line. I just can't get my video to work yet, but yeah, I am on the line and listening.
Awesome. So we're going to actually start out by resolving a cliffhanger from Chad's presentation. We had a polling question. I'm going to repeat the question, and then Chad, we have to know the answer. What buffer distance around LEC locations should be used to avoid impacts to grouse populations when siting wind turbines within the range of grouse? And his options for this were 1.25 miles, 4 miles, 1.8 kilometers, all of the above, or none of the above.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think I tried to make my point that, you know, it should be evaluated on a case by case, and we could throw 0.6 miles, we could throw 0.25 miles, we could throw 3 miles, and these are all the buffers that I have seen come out of conservation plans or agency recommendations. And again, they're used to guide decision makers and managers and developers on how to site. But what I found is that it may not be applicable in all situations. And so the key word here was avoid. It's really difficult to avoid impacts when you're in developing wind energies in grouse habitat. And so the answer is none of the above. And it's important to look at understand avoidance and the difference between avoidance and minimization. So yeah, that was the answer.
Thank you for resolving that for us. There was some debate in the responses. Now, I would like to ask a question to either Chad or John. And while I'm asking these questions, remind the audience to please submit your questions through the questions feature. Any questions we don't have time for during today's webinar, we will respond to after the webinar. But the first question I would love to ask is, what metrics do we feel are most useful for managers when they're analyzing population viability in grouse species? And I know that we've talked about this being case by case, but generally speaking. And that's to either Chad, John, or anyone who feels like they can field that question.
Well, I'll start, then you guys certainly chime in. So when we're talking about metrics informing population viability, we're thinking of all the studies that have been done to date. When we look at nest survival, brood survival, female, male survival, all of those contribute to the ultimate population growth rate, and those do contribute to individuals attending LECs. And so ideally, we can understand those metrics, inform individuals' juvenile recruitment, adult recruitment to LECs each year. We count those individuals and we can kind of get a sense of population viability and look at trends. So I guess my answer would be there's multiple metrics, all of which have been studied, and now we're trying to pull all those metrics into one population viability growth rate assessment.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great answer. There are, I mean, ultimately what we'd like to know is how populations grow over time. And as Chad points out, we'd like to combine all these individual vital rates, survival, reproduction, and get a sense of how collectively they're influencing population growth. That's hard and it takes a lot of time. So there are some other, you know, the behavioral responses, although they don't necessarily inform us as the population level changes, happen much more quickly probably than these demographic changes. So there's value in knowing that too.
Thank you both. Now, our next question, actually, I wrote a question for Mark specifically because Mark gave me a really great tutorial on grouse several months ago. And he actually answered that question in his presentation already. However, we've had kind of a follow-up question. I was going to ask you, Mark, about some of the differences between the grouse species that occur on private lands versus public lands and how that impacts protections related to wind energy. We've had a question from the audience about how much information is available about grouse, I believe, from private lands. And I'm sorry if I'm interpreting this question incorrectly. And has that data from private lands been incorporated into current research? I don't know, Mark, if this is a question for you or if this is something research-wise Chad, John, or Christy can address as well.
Indeed, feels like a panel-wide question. Yeah. This much I do know. Western ground species are comparatively well studied compared to other wildlife, and yet, as Chad and John and Christy noted, there's still so much more to learn about them. Greater sage grouse might be, according to one expert, the most studied species in the West, simply because they are of interest, especially to graduate students looking for their dissertation projects. And as Chad and John reminded us, they faithfully show up to the same breeding ground every spring to be counted, observed, tagged with radio devices and otherwise tracked, so that we can learn perhaps more about these species than we might other wildlife, just because we know where they're going to be every February, March, and April. I understand, I'm not as familiar with lesser prairie chicken, but there's lots and lots of research on that species, including across land ownership. And it's been really great also to have AWWI, American Wind Wildlife Institute, and other organizations and entities providing to that scientific record, helping to compile and develop and publish information that is critical to the species conservation, not just as it relates to wind energy development, but simply what the species requires to persist.
Yeah, I know Chad can probably add to this, but that, yeah, I think of all of the facilities that have been studied, I think with one exception, they've all been located on private land. So to the extent that that answers the question, most of the data we have are coming from private land. Isn't that right, Chad?
Yeah, I'm aware. I think every project was private land. So yeah, and they're monitored. Leks that are on private land are monitored every year by state biologists, and so yeah, we do have a pretty good inventory regarding sage grouse on private lands. So
Thank you. Now this one I have for let's see, for Christy. I know that we talked a little bit about the uncertainty, or actually a lot about the uncertainty that everyone in this field is facing across both research and policy. And I'm hoping you could speak a little bit more to how developers are responding to those uncertainties. And please excuse me if there are any technical issues while Christy talks. Apologies.
Yeah, sorry, I can't get back on the webinar yet, but I'm here. Well, how have developers been responding? I mean, I think the short answer is that there isn't a lot of development going on in areas where sage grouse or lesser prairie chicken are currently. I'm aware of some, but there's not a lot, and definitely, far less in sage grouse areas and federal land. I didn't address federal land in my presentation just because I know that there isn't a lot going on, and certainly from EDPR's perspective, we have been kind of staying away from developing projects on federal land for various reasons. So I think right now, from my perspective, when I have my developers looking, for example, in lesser prairie chicken range or in those states, I try to steer them away because, again, it's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of factors that can occur at the 11th hour that can really, really affect the project. And so I think a lot of the wind industry right now is a little bit, cautious about spending too much money and effort developing these areas until we really can get a better understanding of, the listing decision, and then, what really the requirements will be if we would need to get, if the chicken gets listed and we would need to get regulatory protection under the ESA. I don't know if that answered the question, but short stories, like I don't think there's a lot, there's not a lot of development going on that I'm aware of.
Thank you for that answer. And again, apologies for the technical issues. So our next question is an audience question. What is the main activity associated with wind energy development and operation that most affects grouse, e.g. noise, human presence, etc.?
I think that's an unknown question. Right now, we're just trying to understand if the presence of the facility is impacting grouse, and if we do detect that impact, then we want to try and understand what that mechanism is, and so then we can implement some future minimization options. So that is a big question, whether it's the noise, the shadow flicker, just the positioning on the landscape, the density. So yes, that is the next step, but we first have to get to that point of what is the impact on the population first, and then we can look at mechanisms.
Can I add something to that, Shana? Yeah, and I think what we're looking at is mostly displacement effects, not really direct impacts. Folks can disagree with me on the call, but I think this is a hard issue because we're not talking about direct impacts to the species. We're talking about displacement impacts.
We have another audience question, and again, I'd like to encourage anyone in the audience who has more questions with the last couple minutes remaining to please submit those. This question is, Are there lessons learned from other anthropogenic impacts that we can draw from to help understand grouse behavior and impacts?
Well, I can take a stab at that, and people can fill in. Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but with some qualifications. I mean, as Chad said, and I think as I pointed out, there's it's really difficult to extrapolate sort of specific effects. So if you were going to say, how big of a buffer should we have? Trying to extrapolate from oil and gas, for example, and apply that to wind is going to be problematic. It's even problematic when you look at studies of oil and gas. I mean, the effects aren't consistent across populations. So it's really hard to have specifics. I think what we can take are some general lessons. Cumulative effects can be important. Time lags can be important. And when we think about infrastructure, it isn't just a turbine in this case, or just a oil and gas well, but it's everything that goes along with it.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
No, I think you answered it very well there, John. And I do think wind turbine is another anthropogenic feature on the landscape and has potential to impact grouse, just like a oil and gas well pad or a power line or a road. So it's, again, taking that case by case, where is that wind turbine located relative to the population is going to be whether it's impacting them or not. And so, a wind turbine in the middle of intact habitat is going to impact the population different than a wind turbine in cropland near habitat. So,
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, and so I'd like to leave a little bit of time if anyone has any final thoughts that they'd like to share. Or I don't think we have any other questions from the audience.
Can I?
Yeah, please, Christy.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I did want to just say something really quickly that I wasn't able to regarding studies. Like I said, we believe the studies are very important, but I think we do need to balance, the cost and the time that it takes to get to studies, and just really recognize that there's never going to be a perfect answer, I think, for all involved. And so I think from a wind industry perspective, I think, we're willing to provide conservation benefits, to move forward with projects, to get more clean energy projects in the ground. And I think it's just going to take kind of all of us to try to kind of balance all of that out and not wait for the perfect answer. So just wanted to close with that.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers again for participating. We really appreciate your time today and all of the valuable information that you provided to our attendees. I just want to wrap up our webinar with our last couple minutes remaining and to remind you that you will get a short survey to respond to after this webinar is over. If we do receive any outstanding questions, we will send out answers from our panelists after the series. But if you have any outstanding questions, suggestions, or concerns, you can either email me or my colleague Pasha Feinberg at the emails on here. And I'd like to encourage you to please sign up for the remaining webinars in our series. Again, it's 9 parts, so there's a lot to learn and a lot to watch. And finally, I want to thank our organizers for their work on this series, in particular, Bethany Straw from NREL, who has been absolutely integral to the planning of the entire series. She will be leaving us after this webinar, but she has set us up for success for the rest of the series, which I again hope that you join us for. But thank you again for coming, and please check out the recordings of this and the rest of our series on Tethys. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.